Welcome to the study of the parables of Jesus. This is lesson number 20, the parable of the unmerciful financial agent. Now, this is a difficult parable to find a proper name for. Different translations use different ideas, and I even lost my treatment of it in my computer because I had more than one name for it. So this is the name I've settled on. This is what it is. It's the parable of the unmerciful financial agent. It's found in Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35. I'll give you a few moments to find it, and then we will read it together. In the NIV, it's called the parable of the unmerciful servant. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And then the NIV has a textual footnote that says you could translate that 7 times 70, which would be 490 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents. We've already discussed how difficult it is to translate money from the first century Palestine into present day. Just take that as the equivalent of several $1 million of debt. A man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell to his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged. "I will pay back everything." The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. That's equivalent of about a third of a year's wages for a manual labor. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all this debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers until he paid back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. First of all, let's look at the social and political background that made this parable understandable to Jesus' hearers. No ruler in the first century Mediterranean world had a rational system of taxation that would produce revenue sufficient to cover all the cost of governing their country. This included the Roman government itself. It was not until the 3rd century AD that Rome had a tax system that brought in enough funds to defray the cost of governing the empire. In order to fill the shortfall, most 1st century kings depended on the income from their personal possessions. However, no single person, no matter how gifted in administration they were, could serve as king and administer income-producing property that was spread halfway across the world. Thus, the kings would entrust the management of their property to financial servants or agents. And this is the background of this parable. Look at the literary setting of the parable. Matthew places this parable in the context of Jesus answering his disciples' question about who was greatest in the kingdom, the rule of heaven. We have recently studied the parable of the lost sheep, which precedes this parable in Matthew. Thus, the two parables are two different responses to the same question. The pericope that Matthew places immediately before recording this parable concerns how to treat a fellow believer who has sinned against another. The pericope Matthew places immediately before recording this parable concerns how to treat a fellow believer who has sinned against another believer. So you have that twin idea about the rule of heaven, who is greatest, and then how to treat one another. The purpose of the teaching in Matthew 18:15 through 20 is to protect the harmony that should characterize the covenant people of God. Now, you have this triple theme coming together in this parable. Who's greatest? How do you treat your fellow believer? And how to keep harmony in the covenant people of God. And so you have all of those elements coming together in this parable. Peter realizes that protecting that harmony requires that believers would have to forgive one another. So he comes up to Jesus and asks, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Peter seems to have arrived at the number 7 by taking the total number of times that the Jewish religious teachers taught that a Jew should forgive another Jew during a whole lifetime. And that number was 3. So Peter took that number 3, he doubled it, and just for good measure, he added 1 more. Imagine his shock when Jesus replies in effect that a believer must forgive another believer as often as they ask to be forgiven. This really grates on our human sinful nature. You mean they get off that easy? Well, friend, you got off easier than that with God. And then Jesus illustrates his statement with this parable. Now let's look at the meaning, the significance of the individual elements of this parable. Note that most of the individual elements of this parable have no other significance than to provide a backdrop to to make the drama of the story believable. For example, the king symbolizes any wealthy person, and the agents, servants, are any debtors. However, the amount of money, or the relative amount of money, is significant as for the relative size of the debts. 10,000 talents of gold was truly a king-sized debt. It would have taken the resources of a medium-sized nation several years to pay it off. However, 100 denarii are only about 4 months' wages for a day laborer. Any moderately well-off person could have paid it off in a few months. Note the irony of the language both debtors used to ask for mercy. It is essentially identical in both cases. They both asked, begged, pled for mercy. The difference is one debtor received mercy and the other was refused mercy. All he got was a cold, legalistic form of justice. The difference between the attitudes of the men who received the appeal is the basic theme of this parable. That brings us to the meaning of the parable as a whole. When a sinner responds positively to the call to participate in the kingdom, the rule of heaven, they receive a royal pardon from God, who declares them, on the basis of the sacrificial death of Christ, not guilty. I'm always reminded at this point of British trials that you can see on Masterpiece Theater or something. There is the judge with his white marcelled wig on, and the man is the person charged. The trial has been heard. The jury has brought back the verdict, and then the accused stands, and the judge very portentously either says, guilty as charged, or not guilty. My fellow believer, every one of us who are genuine believers have stood before the judgment bar of God and had the Creator of the universe say, you are not guilty. You will live forever. That royal pardon makes it obligatory for all believers to be ready to forgive the relatively minor sins that other believers commit against them. Just 2 steps left. Making this parable your own. Be constantly and prayerfully aware of the royal pardon you have received from God when you first believed. Then always be eager to discover occasions. Now, this is not with just barely bringing yourself to do it. You ought to be eager to extend that pardon to those who sin against you. Always be eager to discover occasions when you can pass that blessing forward to other believers. Thank you.